All right, last lesson for chapter 17. This one is pretty short, so it won't take very long for us to get through. We are looking at speciation today. All right, so speciation is forming a new species. A species is defined as any population or even a group of populations that can interbreed and then produce fertile offspring. So, for instance, you can breed a lion and a tiger, right? And you can make either a ligon or liger or a tigon. I hope I'm saying that wrong. Depending on which one is the male and which one is the female, but the offspring are not fertile. Same thing happens when you breed a donkey and a horse and you get a mule. Mules are infertile. So mules don't actually make up their own species because they can't produce offspring. Um, the way that we tend to produce new species is through what's called reproductive isolation. There are three methods of this, but it's just anything that separates a species or a population so that they no longer interbreed. And it causes them to evolve differently. So that you end up with two groups that no longer breed together. So they no longer are considered the same species. This is microevolution because, as we're going to see, you're not changing them into something new, right? They're still going to be whatever type of organism they were in the first place. They're just going to have different allele frequencies, okay? So the three types of speciations or isolating mechanisms, the three ways that we can create a speciation event would be behavioral, geographic, or temporal. Behavioral isolation comes from behaviors that the organisms participate in or that they exhibit that prevent them from interbreeding. So a lot of organisms have a courtship ritual that they go through before they will mate. And that's just so that they are recognizing members of their own species. So like these birds here, these are the blue-footed boobies, and they do like a little dance where they show off their feet. And so if you have a bird that doesn't do the dance, they won't mate, they won't interbreed. So having these various rituals, and most organisms have something that they do. There's some pretty interesting ones amongst the birds. There's a bird in I think in the rainforest. They do this weird like slapping with their tail, and it's crazy and cool all at the same time. So behavioral isolation, by having different behaviors that are meant to recognize species. We can't if an individual doesn't exhibit those behaviors, they won't be part of our species. Okay. There's geographic isolation, which is where the population gets split by a geographical barrier into two different populations. Okay, so they're no longer able to pass their genes from one group to another. So natural selection and genetic drift are going to work separately on each group because they're not part of the same population anymore. The level of isolation might change, might be different at different times, or for different organisms within that area. So for instance, you might have lakes that are generally separated. And so populations in each of those lakes would not be able to breed with one another until you have a flood that comes along and then it links those lakes. And so then you could have some interbreeding that would occur for a small period of time. Or you could have a river that separates the ground animals, but not the birds. Okay, so geographic isolation can vary in terms of how prolonged it is or which animals and plants are still affected. So here we have some examples. So being separated on different islands, or having a river especially if the river like suddenly changes course, which happens especially with a flood. Floods tend to change river courses. And suddenly our population is now split into two, and now natural selection is going to act differently in those two areas. Okay, and then if something happens and those two populations were able to come back together, they could be very different and they might no longer interbreed. Okay, so we have this up at the top here. This is some salamanders. So the original population started off in the north and it was migrating southward. And then as it got to a mountain range, it split, or let's see, to the east and west of the Central Valley. Okay, so then we split into two to go around this valley, and accumulated changes and stuff as they migrated south. And once they met up again, they were no longer the same population. They couldn't interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Um, so we now had two different populations of two different species of these salamanders. Okay. Because as they traveled, they just natural selection was working differently in each group. The last type of isolation is temporal, which is where they reproduce at different times. So this could be flowering at different times, different times of day, different times of year. This particular example is showing the difference in the wood frog versus the leopard frog, and when their mating activity is kind of at its highest peak. So they have a little bit of an overlap, but most of their mating time does not correlate to one another. They're not at the same time. Okay, so that's actually the end of this lesson. So this lesson is really just all about those three methods of potentially separating one population into two or more. Okay, so that we would have different, when they get separated, then natural selection can act differently on the two different groups. And then you end up with two different species. Okay, they can no longer interbreed. They are still, in the case of the frogs, they were still frogs, right? But they can no longer interbreed with one another. Okay, so we have microevolution occurring. Okay, this is the last lesson before your test, so you need to make sure that you get the homework done, and that you're working on your reviews, and sending me questions if you have them.